Peasant Wives by Anton Chekhov. In the village of Rebus, right across from the church, there stood a two-story house with a stone foundation and an iron roof. On the lower floor lived the owner, Philip Ivanov Kashin, better known as Dyadya, with his family. The upper floor, though, was hardly used, as it was too hot in the summer and freezing cold in the winter. It was reserved for the occasional government official, merchant, or landowner who happened to be passing through and needed a place to stay. Dyadya rented out bits of land, ran a tavern along the main road, and also dealt in tar, honey, cattle, and even jackdaws. He had saved up around 8,000 rubles in the bank. Dyadya had two sons. The older one, Fyodor, had done well for himself and worked as a chief engineer at a factory. The peasants in the village would say he'd risen so high, he was out of everyone's reach. Fyodor's wife, Sophia, was a plain woman, always looking sickly. She lived with Dyadya and the rest of the family, frequently crying and going to the hospital every Sunday to pick up medicine. The younger son, Alyoshka, was a hunchback who still lived at home with his parents. He had recently married Varvara, a young woman from a poor family. She was beautiful and full of energy, a striking contrast to her husband. Whenever officials or merchants stayed in the house, they would always ask for Varvara to bring in the samovar or make up their beds. One warm June evening, as the sun was setting, filling the air with the scents of hay, fresh milk, and steaming dung heaps, a simple cart pulled into Dyadya's yard. Inside the cart were three people. A man of about 30 dressed in a canvas suit, a little boy of about 7 or 8 sitting beside him in a long black coat with large bone buttons, and a young fellow in a red shirt driving the cart. The driver jumped down first, taking the horses and leading them out into the street to walk them a bit. Meanwhile, the man in the canvas suit got out of the cart, turned toward the church to say a quick prayer, and then spread a rug near the cart to sit down and have supper with the boy. They ate slowly and deliberately. Dyadya, sitting on the steps of his house in just his vest and without a cap, watched them with interest. Over the years, he had seen many travelers come through his home, and he had grown fond of listening to their stories before bed. His wife, Afanasyevna, and his daughter-in-law, Sophia, were in the cowshed busy milking. His other daughter-in-law, Varvara, sat at the upstairs window, absent-mindedly munching on sunflower seeds and spitting out the shells. Dyadya, waiting for the traveler to speak first, finally broke the silence. "That little boy must be your son, right?" "No," replied the traveler. "He's adopted. An orphan. I took him in for the salvation of my soul." Dyadya nodded and listened as the traveler, whose name was Motvy, explained that he was from town, a tradesman, and was now on his way to look at some gardens he was renting from some German settlers. The boy's name was Kuzka. As the conversation continued, night started to fall, and pale stars twinkled in the sky. The hot air hung heavy around them, and no one was in a hurry to go to sleep. Motvy, sensing the peaceful mood, started telling the story of how he came to adopt Kuzka. Afanasyevna and Sophia quietly stepped closer to listen, while Kuzka wandered over to the gate. "It's a long story, old man," Motvy began, and I don't even know where to start. 10 years ago, next door to my house, where there's now a factory that makes tallow and oil, there used to be a little house. An old widow, Marfa Semyonovna Kaplantsev, lived there with her 2 sons. One worked as a guard on the railway, and the other, Vazhya, was about my age and lived with his mother. Matvey paused for a moment, gazing into the distance as he remembered. Old Kaplantsev had been a wealthy man. He owned 5 pairs of horses and ran a successful delivery business. After his death, his widow didn't give up the business. She kept running the delivery services just like her late husband, bringing in 5 rubles a day on a good day. Matvey smiled to himself. Vazhya, the younger son, made a little money on his own. He raised fancy pigeons and sold them to enthusiasts. He'd spend hours on the roof, waving a broom and whistling as his pigeons flew high into the sky. But he wasn't satisfied with just that. He always wanted them to fly higher. He even caught wild birds like siskins and starlings, making cages to sell. These were small things, of course, but he made about 10 rubles a month with them. Life was going smoothly, until Matvey sighed heavily. The old woman fell ill. She lost the use of her legs and had to take to her bed. After that, the house was in disarray. You know, without a woman to run things, a house might as well be without an eye. So, she made up her mind to marry Vazhya off, hoping to settle the house again. She called in a matchmaker, and in no time, they found a girl for him, a young widow's daughter named Mashenka. The hunchback Alyoshka, who had been running around in the street, suddenly burst into the yard, breathless and carrying a concertina. Without looking at anyone, he ran into the house, only to run back out a minute later, jingling coins in his pocket and cracking sunflower seeds between his teeth. "And who's that?" Matvey asked, nodding toward Alyoshka. "My son, Alexei," Dyadya replied. "He's a wild one, always off causing trouble. We try not to be too hard on him, what with his hump and all. He's always drinking," Afanasyevna sighed. "We married him off before the carnival, thinking it might settle him down, but he's worse than ever. Keeping another man's daughter for nothing," Dyadya muttered. "No good has come of it." The conversation was interrupted by a distant, mournful song coming from somewhere behind the church. The words were hard to make out, but the 3 voices, 2 tenors and a bass, carried through the night air. Everyone paused to listen, and for a moment, the yard was still. "That's the priest's sons with the schoolmaster," Varvara said, shielding her eyes with her hand as she looked toward the church. The singing stopped briefly, replaced by loud laughter, but then the voices joined together again, stronger than before. Matvey, lost in his thoughts, sighed and continued his story. "Like I was saying, old man, Vazhya married Mashenka. She was a pretty little thing, only 17, with fair skin and delicate manners. Like a lady really. She brought a nice dowry with her too, 500 rubles, a cow, and a bed. They had only been married 6 months when disaster struck. Vazhya got called up for military service, and wouldn't you know it, he was taken. No exemptions, nothing. They shaved his head and sent him off to Poland. When he said goodbye to his wife in the yard, he tried to hold it together, but when he looked up at the pigeons one last time, he just broke down and cried. It was a sad sight. Matvey shook his head as if reliving the memory. After he left, Mashenka's mother came to stay with her for a while, especially after little Kuzka was born. But after a few months, the mother left for Aboyan to live with her other daughter, leaving Mashenka all alone with the baby. She had to manage 5 rowdy, drunken workers, the horses, and everything else on her own. Naturally, she started turning to me for help since I lived next door. Matvey paused and chuckled softly, as if embarrassed by what came next. Well, one thing led to another. I started going over there more and more, fixing things around the house, helping with the horses, and always stopping in for a cup of tea. I talked to her about all sorts of things, religion, politics, anything. I was a young man, full of energy, and she liked the attention. She was well-mannered, always neat and clean, and in the summer, she'd walk around with a parasol like a real lady. He paused, his expression darkening. It didn't take long before I realized that any day I didn't visit her, I felt off. I'd make up excuses to see her. I'd tell myself, I should check on Vazhya's pigeons, or I'll go over there and put up the storm windows. I even made a little gate in the fence between our yards so I wouldn't have to walk all the way around. Matvey's voice grew quieter as he continued. You know how it goes, old man. Temptation sneaks up on you, and before you know it, you're lost. Mashenka fell for me, and I fell for her. I tried to tell myself it was wrong, but she'd walk by the fence and look into my yard through the cracks, and I couldn't help myself. One morning, on the Thursday before Easter, I was passing by her gate on my way to the market, and there she was, standing in the yard feeding the ducks. She looked at me, and I couldn't resist. I called her name, and she came to the gate. She was pale and sleepy, but her eyes, they were soft, and she didn't look away. I lost all sense and confessed my love for her right there. Matvey paused, his face filled with regret as he recalled the events that followed. She opened the gate, and from that morning on, we started living like husband and wife, though not in the eyes of the law, of course. At first it felt like we were in heaven. There was something thrilling about it, something forbidden. But, as with most things, it didn't last. Matvey took a deep breath and continued. We carried on like that for about 2 years. Then, one day, a letter arrived from Vazhya. He was coming back from Poland, sick and worn out. He'd been discharged due to illness and would be home in a matter of days. At this, Matvey's expression darkened, and he shook his head slowly. I knew it was wrong, everything we'd done. And I wanted to end it, to tell Mashenka that it was time for her to go back to her husband, but I didn't know how to do it. How do you tell a woman who's fallen in love with you that it's over? I wrestled with it for days. He looked down at his hands, as though he could still feel the weight of that decision. When the letter came, Mashenka turned white as a sheet. She knew what it meant, and she wasn't happy about it. I told her, "It's time, Moshe. Vazhya's your husband. He's been through enough. It's time for you to go back to him. But she wouldn't hear of it. I never loved him, she said. I married him because my mother made me. It's you I love, and I'll stay with you until the day I die. Let people gossip, I don't care. Motvi's voice grew heavy with guilt. I tried to reason with her, tried to remind her of what the scriptures say, that once a woman is married, she must stay with her husband. But she wouldn't listen. She said she couldn't bear to live without me. Motvi paused as if weighing the next part of his story. When Vajya finally arrived, it was early in the morning, just before Trinity Sunday. I remember it clearly. I watched him from my yard. He ran into his house, scooped Kuzka up in his arms, and started laughing and crying at the same time. The poor guy hadn't seen his son since the day he left, and he was so overwhelmed. He kissed the boy, looked up at the hayloft where his pigeons used to roost, and you could see he was filled with joy and relief. It was pitiful to watch. Motvi wiped his brow, as if the memory still weighed on him. That first day went smoothly enough. Everything seemed normal. But the next day, just as they were ringing the church bells for the evening service, I started to get a strange feeling. It was Trinity Sunday, and I realized they hadn't decorated the gates or the fences with greenery, like people usually do. Something wasn't right. I went over to check on them, and what I saw. Well, it's hard to forget. Motvi's face darkened even more. There was Vajya, sitting on the floor in the middle of the room, staring into space like a man possessed. Tears streamed down his face, and his hands were trembling as he pulled out little gifts from his bag. Cracknels, gingerbread nuts, and other trinkets he had brought for Mashenka and Kuzka. Kuzka, who was about 3 years old by then, was crawling around on the floor, munching on the gingerbread, while Mashenka stood by the stove, pale and shaking. She was muttering, "I'm not your wife. I can't live with you." Motvi sighed deeply. I didn't know what to do. I knelt down before Vajya and said, "We've sinned against you, Vasily Maximych. Please, forgive us for Christ's sake." I meant it too, old man. I really did. I told Mashenka that she needed to wash Vajya's feet and drink the water, to humble herself and beg his forgiveness. She needed to go back to him, be his wife again, and pray for both our souls. Motvi's voice grew soft, filled with a strange sense of regret and resignation. 2 days later, Vajya came to me. He looked more at peace, calmer somehow. He said to me, "Matyusha, I forgive you and Mashenka. It wasn't easy for her, being alone while I was away. She's not the first to make a mistake like this, and she won't be the last. But all I ask is that you pretend like nothing happened. Don't talk to her, don't visit her, and I'll do my best to make her love me again." Motvi shook his head. He was a good man, Vajya. Too good for this world, maybe. He gave me his hand, drank a cup of tea with me, and left, looking more cheerful. I thought that was the end of it, and in a way, I was relieved. But that was just the beginning of the real tragedy. Motvi paused to collect his thoughts before continuing. Not long after Vajya left my yard, Mashenka came running to me, tears streaming down her face. She threw herself into my arms, begging me not to leave her. "I can't live without you," she sobbed. "If you don't love me, then just kill me now." I was at my wit's end. I yelled at her, pushed her away, and told her to go back to her husband. "Fear God, Moshe," I told her. "I'm done with this. You need to go back to Vazia." But she wouldn't listen. Motvy clenched his fists, his face etched with pain as he relived the memory. One morning, I was out in my yard near the stables, fixing a bridle, when I saw her running barefoot through the gate, straight toward me. She grabbed the bridle, getting her hands all covered in pitch, and cried out, "I hate him. I can't stand living with him. If you don't take me back, then kill me." I was so angry, I struck her twice with the bridle. But just then, Vazia appeared. He must have seen the whole thing, because he came running toward us, shouting, "Don't hit her. Don't you dare hit her." Motvy's voice trembled as he described what happened next. Vazia lost it. He was like a man possessed. He started swinging his fists at her, hitting her as hard as he could. He knocked her to the ground and started kicking her, over and over again. I tried to stop him, but he grabbed the reins and started thrashing her with them. All the while, he was making this horrible noise, like a colt whinnying. Motvy closed his eyes, the memory too painful to bear. We managed to pull Mashenka away from him, but the damage was done. She was bruised and beaten, barely able to stand. That evening, I went over to check on them. Mashenka was lying in bed, wrapped up in bandages, with only her eyes and nose showing. She didn't say a word. Vazia, meanwhile, was sitting in the next room, his head in his hands, crying and muttering to himself, "I've ruined everything. I've ruined my life." Motvy paused and looked up at the sky, as if searching for answers. The next day, Vazia fell ill. Some kind of fever, maybe cholera. By evening, he was dead. They buried him quickly, but Mashenka didn't go to the funeral. She was too ashamed to show her face, with all those bruises. Motvy's voice grew quiet, almost a whisper. After that, rumors started to spread. People said Vazia hadn't died of natural causes, that Mashenka had poisoned him. It didn't take long for the authorities to get wind of it. They exhumed the body, and sure enough, they found arsenic in his stomach. Mashenka was arrested, along with little Kuzka. They threw them both in jail, and that was the end of it. He sighed deeply, his face lined with regret. 8 months later, they put her on trial. She sat there in court, wearing a little white kerchief on her head and a gray prison gown. She was so thin and pale, barely a shadow of the woman I once knew. She never admitted to the poisoning, not once. Some people said she did it, others said Vazia poisoned himself out of grief. I was called as a witness. I told the truth, the whole truth. "She's guilty," I said. She never loved him, and she was stubborn as they come. Motvy looked at the ground, his voice filled with sorrow. They sentenced her to 13 years of hard labor in Siberia. After the trial, I went to visit her in prison, out of Christian charity, and brought her some tea and sugar. But as soon as she saw me, she started shaking all over, like a terrified animal. She clung to Kuzka, as if I was going to take him away. "Go away," she kept saying. "Go away." I tried to talk sense into her, but she wouldn't listen. He paused for a long moment before finishing the story. She never made it to Siberia. She fell sick with fever and died in prison. And that's how it ended. Dyadya, who had been listening quietly the whole time, finally spoke up. "Live like a dog, die like a dog," he muttered. Motvy nodded. Kuzka was sent back home, and I couldn't bear to see him end up in an orphanage. So, I took him in. After all, even though he's the child of a convict, he's still a Christian soul. I'm raising him to be my clerk, and if I don't have any children of my own, I'll make him a merchant. Throughout Motvy's story, Kuzka had been sitting near the gate, staring up at the sky. He hadn't moved or said a word the entire time. "Kuzka, come on, it's time for bed," Motvy called out. The boy slowly stood up and made his way over to the cart. He curled up in the hay, pulling his little coat over his head to keep warm. "It's getting late," Dyadya said, yawning. "Time for everyone to turn in." The moon was now high in the sky, its pale light casting long shadows over the yard. Motvy said a quick prayer, facing the church, then lay down on the ground beside his cart. Kuzka, still curled up in the hay, closed his eyes, while Dyadya and his family retreated inside. As the house grew quiet, Afanasyevna and Sophia tiptoed out to the cart, where Kuzka was already asleep. "The poor boy," whispered Afanasyevna, looking down at him. "He's all skin and bones. No mother, no one to properly care for him." "My Grushatka must be 2 years older," Sophia said softly, wiping her eyes. "Living up at the factory, practically a slave without his mother. I bet the foreman beats him. When I look at this poor boy, I think of my Grushatka, and my heart breaks." They stood there silently for a while, looking at the little boy curled up in the cart. "I wonder if he remembers his mother," Afanasyevna said after a moment. "How could he? He was so young," Sophia replied. Tears welled up in Sophia's eyes as she continued, "Look how he curls up, like a kitten. Poor, motherless child." Kuzka stirred and opened his eyes, startled to see 2 faces hovering over him in the moonlight. Sophia's tear-streaked face and Afanasyevna's wrinkled, bird-like one frightened him, and he let out a little cry. His shout echoed through the still night, breaking the silence, and a faint stir passed over the yard. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and Motvy Savich mumbled something in his sleep, turning over on the other side. As the night deepened, Sophia's thoughts grew heavier. Feeling restless, she quietly slipped out of the house again and sat on the bench near the gate. She needed to clear her mind, to escape the suffocating sadness that had been gripping her chest all evening. The street stretched out before her, wide and deserted, bathed in the cold light of the moon. On one side, the houses and poplars cast long shadows, while the other side was swallowed in darkness. The shadows of the church and the tall starling houses loomed over Dyadya's gates, giving the entire scene an eerie, still atmosphere. The occasional notes of a concertina floated through the air from somewhere down the road, likely Alyoshka playing on one of his midnight sprees. For a moment, Sophia thought she saw a figure moving in the shadows near the churchyard. She squinted, trying to make out whether it was a person, a cow, or just the wind playing tricks on her. The figure stepped out from the shadows, paused briefly, then turned and disappeared down the road by the church. Not long after, another figure emerged from the darkness, this time walking straight toward the gate. As it got closer, Sophia realized it was Varvara. "Varvara, is that you?" Sophia whispered. "And what if it is?" Varvara replied, her voice sharp but amused. Varvara sat down beside Sophia on the bench without another word. "Where have you been?" Sophia asked quietly. Varvara shrugged, not meeting Sophia's gaze. "You'd better be careful, Varvara," Sophia said after a moment of silence. "If you're sneaking off like this, you could end up in trouble. Did you hear what happened to Mashenka? She was beaten and thrashed with reins. You should be careful or they'll do the same to you." Varvara laughed softly into her kerchief and whispered, "I was just with the priest's son." "You're lying." Sophia gasped. "I'm not. It's a sin." Sophia whispered, shocked. "Let it be a sin then," Varvara said with a defiant shrug. "What do I care? Better to be struck dead by lightning than live like this. I'm young and healthy, and look what I've got. Married off to a hunchback who's worse than Dayadya himself. I only married him for his money, to get away from the poverty I was born into, and now I'm stuck. I'd rather have a viper for a husband than that Alyoshka." Varvara's eyes flashed with anger as she went on. "And look at you. You work like a horse for Dayadya, and what do you get in return? Fyodor sent you packing from the factory, and now he's taken up with another woman. They took your boy away from you and treat him like a slave. You never hear a kind word, and for what? You're no better off than me." Sophia felt a wave of shame and sorrow wash over her. She didn't have the strength to deny Varvara's words, and deep down, she knew they were true. She felt like a prisoner in her own life, trapped by circumstances beyond her control. "It's a sin," Sophia whispered again, though her voice was weaker this time. "Let it be," Varvara replied with a bitter smile. "At least I'm living a little." Behind the church, the mournful singing started again. 2 tenors and a bass, their voices carrying through the night. The sad, soulful tune stirred something inside Sophia, a deep longing for a life she'd never had. She began to laugh quietly, though she wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the absurdity of it all, her own wasted youth, the misery she'd grown used to, and the fleeting moments of happiness that always seemed just out of reach. Varvara, sensing Sophia's change in mood, leaned closer and whispered, "The priest's son is quite a storyteller, you know. He's told me all kinds of things. We laugh together, talk about all sorts of adventures. Oh, you wouldn't believe the fun I've had with the travelers who stay here." Sophia felt a pang of envy. She had never been bold like Varvara. When she was young and pretty, she had always been afraid to break the rules, afraid of what people would say or think. But now, Sitting in the moonlit street, she realized how much she had missed out on, how much life had passed her by. In the churchyard, the watchman's board beat 12 times, marking midnight. "It's late," Sophia said, standing up. "We should go to bed. If Dyadia catches us out here, we'll both get an earful." The two women slipped back into the yard, moving quietly so as not to wake anyone. "I never finished hearing what Motvy was saying about Mashenka," Varvara whispered as they made their way inside. "He said she died in prison," Sophia replied, her voice low. "She poisoned her husband." Varvara lay down beside Sophia, thinking for a moment before speaking softly. "I could kill Alyoshka and never feel a bit of regret." Sophia shuddered and said nothing. After a long pause, she finally whispered, "People would find out." "No, they wouldn't. Dyadia's an old man. He's lived long enough as it is. And Alyoshka? People would just say he died from drinking too much." "I'm scared," Sophia murmured, her voice trembling. "God would punish us." "Let him then," Varvara replied, her tone dismissive. The two women lay there in silence, each lost in her own thoughts. The cold night air made Sophia shiver, and she pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "It's cold," Sophia whispered. "Morning will come soon. Are you asleep?" "No," Varvara replied after a pause. "Don't pay any attention to me, Sophia. Sometimes I get so mad at those men, I don't know what I'm saying. Go to sleep now. The sun will be up before we know it." Soon after, they both drifted into a restless sleep, the weight of their lives pressing down on them. The next morning, long before the sun was up, Afanasyevna was the first to wake. She nudged Sophia awake, and the two of them quietly slipped out to the cowshed to start milking the cows. Alyoshka stumbled in a short while later, hopelessly drunk, his clothes covered in dust and straw. He had clearly fallen on the way home, and his concertina was nowhere to be seen. Without bothering to undress, he collapsed into a nearby sledge and began snoring loudly. As the morning light began to peek over the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard, Motvy Savage jumped up from where he had been sleeping beside the cart. "Kuzka, get up," he called out. "Time to get the horses ready." Kuzka, groggy and covered in dew, sat up slowly in the cart. He rubbed his eyes and shivered as he slipped into his little overcoat, the cool morning air making him shiver. "Auntie," Motvy called to Sophia, who was busy with the cows. "Tell the boy to hurry up and harness the horses." At that same moment, Dyadia's voice rang out from the house. "Sophia, make sure to charge that Jewess a farthing for watering her horse. These people come here, drink our water for free, and think they can just leave." Outside, the street was slowly coming to life. A group of sheep, herded by a young boy with a whip, passed by, their bleating filling the air. The shepherd played his pipes lazily as he tried to keep the flock in order. 3 of the sheep wandered into the yard, nudging the fence as they tried to find their way out. Varvara, still bleary-eyed from the night before, stumbled out of the house with her bedding in her arms. Afanasyevna called after her, "You could at least help drive the sheep out, my lady." I dare say. As if I'm going to slave for you. Varvara muttered under her breath as she walked past her mother-in-law. Dyadya emerged from the house, carrying his accounts. He settled down on the steps and began tallying how much the traveler owed him for his stay, the oats, and the water for the horses. "Your oats are quite pricey, my good man," Motvy remarked, glancing at the calculations. "If you don't like the prices, don't buy them," Dyadya shot back. "No one's forcing you, merchant." As the travelers prepared to leave, they were suddenly held up. Kuzka had lost his cap. "Little swine! Where did you put it?" Motvy roared, anger boiling over. "Where is it?" Kuzka's face contorted with fear. He dashed around near the cart, then ran to the gate, back to the shed, desperately searching for his cap. Afanasyevna and Sophia helped him look, both of them concerned. "I'll tear your ears off," Motvy yelled. "You filthy brat." Finally, they found the cap at the bottom of the cart. Kuzka brushed off the hay, put it on his head, and crawled timidly back into the cart, still looking terrified, as though expecting a beating at any moment. Motvy crossed himself, his expression softening slightly. He watched as the driver tugged on the reins, signaling that it was time to go. The cart began to roll out of the yard, and everyone breathed a sigh of relief, glad to see them off. As the sun rose higher in the sky, the village began to stir. The sounds of farm animals and people filled the air, a reminder that life moved on, even after tragedy. Dyadya returned to his accounts, while Afanasyevna and Sophia finished milking the cows, their minds still heavy with the weight of the stories they had heard. Later that day, as the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the fields, Sophia found herself wandering back to the cart where Kuzka had slept. She sat down beside him, her heart aching for the little boy. She could see him playing with a bit of straw, his innocent face focused on a task only he could understand. "Hey there, Kuzka," she said gently. The boy looked up at her, his big eyes wide with curiosity. "What do you want to be when you grow up?" Kuzka shrugged, looking shy. "Do you want to be a merchant like Motvy?" she asked, trying to engage him. He shook his head vigorously. "No. I want to be a bird. So I can fly away." Sophia chuckled, touched by his innocence. "A bird, huh? That sounds wonderful. But even birds have to come back to the ground sometimes, you know." "Why?" Kuzka asked, tilting his head. "Because we all need a home. Even birds have nests." Kuzka frowned, deep in thought. "But what if you don't have a home?" The question struck Sophia like a blow. Her heart ached for him, knowing he was one of the few children in the village who didn't have a real family. "Well," she said softly, "then you make your own home. You find a place that feels safe and warm, like a nest." Kuzka nodded, his expression serious. "Okay. I'll find a nest." Just then, Varvara walked by, overhearing the conversation. "What's this? You're talking about nests? Is Kuzka going to be a bird now?" she teased, but there was a hint of softness in her voice. "He said he wants to fly away," Sophia replied, a smile on her face despite the heaviness in her heart. Varvara's smile faded. Poor kid. He has no idea what life is really like. Flying away won't save him from all this. Sophia looked at her, surprised by the sudden change in Varvara's mood. You think it's hopeless? Varvara sighed and sat down beside them, resting her chin on her knees. I just know it's hard. Life isn't fair. Sometimes I wish I could just run away too. Where would you go? Sophia asked. Anywhere but here, Varvara replied. Somewhere I could be free, away from all this nonsense. Away from Dyadya, away from Alyoshka. Sophia nodded slowly, feeling a twinge of understanding. I feel the same way sometimes. Kuzka, sensing the tension, looked back and forth between the two women. Can we fly away together? He asked, his voice hopeful. Varvara and Sophia exchanged glances, and for a moment, they both forgot their troubles, caught up in the innocence of the boy's words. Sure, Kuzka, Varvara said, ruffling his hair. We'll find a way to fly away. And in that moment, they shared a brief smile, a flicker of hope amid the shadows of their lives. As the days turned into weeks, life in the village continued. The stories of Mashenka and Vazhya faded into whispers, but the weight of their tragedy lingered in the air. The villagers spoke in hushed tones, cautioning one another about love and betrayal, about the dangers of longing for something beyond reach. Dyadya, now more withdrawn, focused on his business. He spent hours poring over accounts, counting every ruble as though it held the key to his happiness. Afanasyevna and Sophia busied themselves with chores, milking cows and tending to the household, while Varvara became more restless, often slipping away into the night, drawn by the thrill of adventure and the company of the priest's son. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the fields, Varvara returned home late. She was giggling and breathless, her cheeks flushed with excitement. Where have you been? Afanasyevna asked, her voice tinged with concern. Just out and about, Varvara replied, trying to sound casual. You're always out and about. You'll get yourself into trouble one of these days, Sophia warned, her tone serious. Let her be, Afanasyevna. She's young. It's good for her to enjoy life, Dyadya chimed in, surprising both women. She's not a little girl anymore. Besides, she's got to make her own way. Varvara beamed at her father-in-law's unexpected support, but Afanasyevna remained unconvinced. Just remember, Varvara, that freedom comes with a price. You can't go running around without thinking of the consequences. Varvara waved her hand dismissively. I know. But what's the point of living if you can't have a little fun? The following day, news spread through the village that the authorities had been keeping a close eye on the townsfolk. Whispers filled the air, people exchanging glances and murmurs of concern. They were worried about the police cracking down on anyone who dared to step outside the norms. Many began to feel restless and anxious, worried that the past would come back to haunt them. Sophia felt the tension in the air, her heart heavy with unease. As she walked to the market that day, She couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. The streets were unusually quiet, and the usual chatter of neighbors felt muted. The sun shone brightly, but she felt a chill creeping into her bones. When she reached the market, the atmosphere was tense. A group of men gathered around a stall, their voices low and serious. Sophia approached, trying to catch snippets of their conversation. "The police are looking for anyone who's been causing trouble. They want to root out any sign of rebellion," one man said. Another shook his head, looking worried. "We need to keep our heads down. If they come after us, there's no telling what will happen." Sophia felt a shiver run down her spine. She quickly turned and made her way back home, her heart pounding in her chest. The weight of fear hung heavy over her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the safety of her family was at risk. When she got home, she found Varvara sitting on the porch, laughing and chatting with a group of young men. The carefree atmosphere clashed sharply with the unease that had settled over Sophia. "Varvara," she called, trying to keep her voice steady. "You shouldn't be out here. The police are looking for troublemakers." Varvara rolled her eyes, dismissing Sophia's concerns. "Oh, come on, Sophia. I'm just having a bit of fun. It's nothing serious." Sophia felt a pang of frustration. "You don't understand. This isn't a game. You could get yourself into real trouble." Varvara laughed, brushing off her sister-in-law's warning. "You worry too much. Life is short, and I want to enjoy it while I can." Sophia opened her mouth to argue but found no words. Instead, she turned away, feeling defeated. She didn't understand how Varvara could be so careless, so oblivious to the danger that loomed around them. As the days passed, the tension in the village only seemed to grow. The whispers about the police intensified, and people began to change their routines. They kept their heads down, avoiding any behavior that might draw attention. One evening, while the sun set in vibrant oranges and reds, Dyadia gathered the family around the table. His face was serious, and his voice was low. "We need to be careful," he said, his eyes scanning the room. "The authorities are looking for reasons to crack down. We don't want to give them any excuse to come after us." Afanasyevna nodded, her expression grim. "We should lay low for a while. No more drawing attention." Varvara huffed in frustration. "Why should we live in fear? I'm not going to stop living just because some police officer might be watching." Dyadia's eyes narrowed, and his voice took on a hard edge. "You'll do as I say, Varvara. We're not going to risk this family for your fun and games." The tension around the table was thick, and for the first time, Varvara fell silent. She looked down at her plate, her carefree demeanor crumbling slightly under Dyadia's stern gaze. Sophia felt a wave of relief wash over her, grateful that Dyadia had finally put his foot down. But even as the family agreed to stay quiet and out of trouble, a sense of foreboding lingered in the air. It wasn't long before the police made their presence known in the village. They conducted searches, questioning anyone who seemed suspicious. The mood in the village grew darker with each passing day, and people whispered of those who had been taken away for questioning, never to return. Sofia, Afanasyevna, and even Varvara kept to themselves, working quietly around the house and yard, doing their best not to draw attention. Dyadya became more watchful, always keeping an eye on the road for any sign of trouble. One evening, after a long tense day, Sofia sat by the window, staring out at the darkening sky. Varvara came over, sitting beside her, unusually quiet. "I'm sorry, Sofia," Varvara whispered. "I didn't mean to put us in danger. I didn't think." Sofia turned to her, surprised by the sudden vulnerability. "It's okay, Varvara. We're all scared. We just need to be careful." Varvara nodded, her expression softening. "I'll be more careful. I promise." As they sat together in silence, Sofia felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could get through this. Maybe they could find a way to survive, to make a home for themselves in this uncertain world. But even as that small hope flickered, Sofia knew deep down that life would never be easy. They would always be walking a fine line between survival and danger, between freedom and fear. And in the end, all they could do was hope that, somehow, they would manage to fly away.
Thank you for listening. Like, subscribe, and share our channel Magic Mingle with your friends to enjoy more magical stories.